Chicago, October 1925. The autumn wind carried the scent of Lake Michigan through the bustling streets, where the city hummed with the energy of the Prohibition era. In the heart of downtown, the Lexington Hotel stood as a fortress of power, its elegant facade hiding the empire that Alfonso Capone had built from the shadows of illegal liquor and underground speakeasies. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Capone's office on the fourth floor, casting long shadows across the mahogany desk where newspapers lay scattered. Headlines screamed about federal raids and bootlegger arrests, but Al Capone remained unperturbed as he adjusted his silk tie and checked his gold pocket watch. A knock echoed through the heavy oak door. "Come in," Capone called, his voice carrying the authority that commanded respect throughout Chicago's underworld. The door opened to reveal Johnny Torrio, his trusted lieutenant, accompanied by a young woman with auburn hair styled in the fashionable bob cut of the era. She wore a modest navy blue dress that fell just below her knees, and her posture conveyed both professionalism and quiet confidence. "Boss, this is Miss Catherine Hayes," Torrio announced, stepping aside to allow the woman to enter. "She comes highly recommended for the secretary position. Worked for several prominent businessmen in New York before moving to Chicago." Catherine stepped forward, her green eyes meeting Capone's steady gaze without flinching. "Mr. Capone, it's an honor to meet you. I understand you need someone capable of managing correspondence and maintaining discretion in all business matters." Capone studied her carefully, noting the way she carried herself with quiet determination. In his line of work, reading people was a matter of survival, and something about this woman intrigued him beyond her obvious qualifications. "Miss Hayes, in my organization, loyalty is everything," Capone said, rising from his chair and walking around the desk. "The work here requires absolute confidentiality. Can you handle that?" "Absolutely, Mr. Capone. I understand the importance of discretion in business operations," Catherine replied, her voice steady despite the intensity of his scrutiny. The interview continued for another 20 minutes, during which Catherine demonstrated her typing skills on the black Underwood typewriter and showed impressive knowledge of filing systems and business correspondence. Her references from New York checked out perfectly, and her ability to take dictation in shorthand was exactly what Capone needed for his expanding operations. "You start Monday morning, 8 sharp," Capone decided, extending his hand. "Welcome to the organization, Miss Hayes." As Catherine shook his hand, neither of them could have predicted how this simple business arrangement would evolve into something far more complex and dangerous than either had bargained for. 3 weeks had passed since Margaret Sullivan began working as Al Capone's secretary, and she had fallen into a routine that balanced her cover identity with her covert mission. Each morning, she arrived at the office on South Wabash Avenue precisely at 7 o'clock, her hair perfectly styled and her modest dresses pressed to perfection. The other employees had accepted her as part of the organization, and she had begun to gather valuable intelligence about shipment routes, payment schedules, and territorial agreements. The speakeasy business was booming in the fall of 1925, and Capone's operation had expanded to control nearly every illegal drinking establishment on the south side of Chicago. Margaret had learned to decode the seemingly innocent telephone conversations that discussed furniture deliveries and inventory transfers, understanding that these were actually coordinating massive shipments of Canadian whiskey and homemade gin. On this particular Tuesday morning, Margaret was transcribing notes from a meeting when she noticed Jake Guzik watching her with an expression of concern. He approached her desk with the caution of a man who had survived the dangerous streets of Chicago by trusting his instincts. "Miss Sullivan, Mr. Capone would like to see you in his office." Margaret's heart rate quickened, but she maintained her composure. "Oh, of course, Mr. Guzik. Did he mention what this was regarding?" "Just bring your stenography pad. He has some important correspondence to dictate." She gathered her materials and walked down the familiar hallway, passing the photographs of Chicago's skyline and the legitimate businesses that provided cover for the organization's activities. The door to Capone's office was slightly ajar, and she could hear him speaking in low tones to someone she couldn't see. "Come in. Miss Sullivan," Capone called out before she had a chance to knock. Inside the office, she found Capone seated behind his desk with Frank Nitti, his trusted enforcer, standing near the window. Nitti was a lean man with sharp features and cold eyes that made Margaret uncomfortable whenever he was present. Today, those eyes seemed to be studying her with particular intensity. "Please sit down," Capone said, his voice carrying a warmth that contrasted sharply with Nitty's icy presence. "I wanted to discuss your progress with us. You've been doing excellent work." "Thank you, sir. I'm very grateful for this position." Capone leaned forward, resting his elbows on his desk. "Tell me, Miss Sullivan, what do you think of our organization? How do we compare to your previous employer?" The question seemed innocent enough, but Margaret sensed an undercurrent of tension in the room. "It's quite different from the law firm, of course. Much more dynamic and fast-paced. The work is challenging, but I find it rewarding. And the nature of our business doesn't concern you." Nitty spoke for the first time, his voice carrying a subtle threat. Margaret had prepared for this moment, knowing that eventually her loyalty would be tested. "Mr. Nitty, I understand that business in Chicago requires a certain level of flexibility. My job is to be efficient and discreet, not to judge business decisions." Capone smiled, but Margaret noticed it didn't reach his eyes. "Frank has been concerned about security lately. We've had some problems with federal agents trying to infiltrate our operations. You understand our need to be cautious." "Of course, sir. If there's anything specific you'd like me to do to address these concerns, I'm happy to help." The two men exchanged a glance that made Margaret's skin crawl. She had been trained to handle interrogation, but sitting in this room with two of Chicago's most dangerous criminals, she felt the full weight of her dangerous position. "Actually, there is something," Capone said, rising from his chair and walking around to lean against the front of his desk. The movement brought him closer to Margaret, and she caught the scent of his expensive cologne mixed with cigarette smoke. "I'm hosting a small gathering at my home in Cicero this Saturday evening. Some business associates, a few ladies from the neighborhood. I'd like you to attend as my guest." The invitation caught Margaret completely off guard. Attending a social function at Capone's home would provide incredible intelligence opportunities, but it would also put her in far greater danger than her current position. "I'm honored by the invitation, Mr. Capone, but I wouldn't want to impose on what sounds like a personal gathering." "Nonsense. You've become an important part of our organization, Miss Sullivan. Besides," his voice dropped to a more intimate tone, "I'd enjoy the company of someone with your intelligence and refinement." Margaret felt heat rise to her cheeks, and she realized with alarm that her reaction wasn't entirely feigned. Despite knowing exactly who Al Capone was and what he represented, she found herself responding to his charm and magnetism in ways that went against her training and her mission. "If you think it would be appropriate, then I'd be delighted to attend." "Excellent. I'll send a car for you Saturday at 7 o'clock. Wear something nice but not too formal. We keep things comfortable in Cicero." As Margaret left the office, she could feel Nitty's suspicious gaze following her down the hallway. She returned to her desk and continued with her daily tasks, but her mind was racing with the implications of Saturday's invitation. This could be the breakthrough her superiors at the Bureau of Investigation had been hoping for: access to Capone's inner circle and his private residence. That evening, as she walked through the darkening streets to her modest apartment on the north side, Margaret composed the coded message she would send to Agent Mackenzie. The invitation to Capone's home represented both an incredible opportunity and a significant escalation of risk. What troubled her most, however, was the realization that her reaction to Capone's attention hadn't been entirely professional. Despite her training and her mission, she was beginning to understand why so many people were drawn to Al Capone's magnetic personality. The man was genuinely charming, intelligent, and surprisingly thoughtful in his interactions with her. As she climbed the stairs to her apartment, Margaret reminded herself that charm and intelligence didn't change the fact that Al Capone was responsible for countless acts of violence and corruption. Her job was to gather evidence that would help bring him to justice, not to develop complicated feelings about her target. But as she prepared her coded report that night, she couldn't shake the memory of how his eyes had warmed when he looked at her, or the way her heart had raced when he called her intelligent and refined. Saturday evening arrived with the crisp bite of late autumn in Chicago. Margaret stood before the mirror in her small apartment, adjusting the emerald green dress she had purchased specifically for this occasion. The silk fabric was expensive by her standards, but Agent Mackenzie had approved the expenditure as necessary for maintaining her cover. The dress was elegant without being ostentatious, with a modest neckline and a hemline that fell just below her knees in the fashionable style of 1925. At precisely 7 o'clock, a black Cadillac automobile pulled up outside her apartment building. Margaret had been watching from her window, and she quickly gathered her small beaded purse and coat before making her way downstairs. The driver was a well-dressed man she recognized from the office as one of Capone's trusted associates, Tommy O'Connor. "Evening, Miss Sullivan. You look lovely tonight," Tommy said, tipping his hat as he held the car door open for her. "Thank you, Mr. O'Connor. I appreciate you making the drive." The journey to Cicero took nearly 40 minutes, through the busy streets of Chicago and into the suburb where Capone had established his headquarters away from the scrutiny of the Chicago police. Margaret used the time to review her mental notes about what she hoped to observe and learn during the evening. The house at 7244 South Prairie Avenue was modest from the outside, a two-story home that could have belonged to any successful businessman in the area. Inside, however, the residence revealed the wealth and taste of its owner. Persian rugs covered polished hardwood floors, and oil paintings in gilded frames decorated the walls. The sound of jazz music drifted from a radio in the living room, where approximately 20 guests mingled with cocktails in hand. Despite prohibition, illegal alcohol flowed freely, served by discreet waitstaff who moved through the rooms with practiced efficiency. Capone appeared at Margaret's side almost immediately after her arrival, dressed in an impeccably tailored navy blue suit with a silk pocket square. His hair was perfectly groomed, and his smile seemed genuinely pleased to see her. "Miss Sullivan, you look absolutely stunning. Welcome to my home. Thank you for inviting me, Mr. Capone. Your home is beautiful. Please, tonight you can call me Al. We're not in the office, and I'd like you to feel comfortable here." He placed a gentle hand on her elbow, guiding her into the living room. "Let me introduce you to some friends." The next hour passed in a blur of introductions and polite conversation. Margaret met the wives and girlfriends of various associates, local businessmen who were clearly benefiting from Capone's protection, and several politicians whose presence confirmed the extent of corruption in the Chicago area. She carefully memorized names and faces, storing information that would prove valuable to her superiors at the Bureau of Investigation. During dinner, Margaret found herself seated to Capone's right at an elegant dining table set with fine china and crystal glasses. The conversation ranged from local politics to the latest fashions from New York, and she was impressed by Capone's knowledge of literature and current events. This wasn't the crude gangster portrayed in newspaper accounts, but an intelligent and cultured man who happened to make his living outside the law. "Tell me about your family, Margaret," Capone said during a lull in the general conversation. The use of her first name sent an unexpected thrill through her. "You mentioned your father worked for the railroad?" Margaret had rehearsed her false biography countless times, but sitting so close to Capone, with his dark eyes focused intently on her face, she found it more difficult than usual to maintain the deception. "Yes, he was a conductor on the Chicago and Northwestern line. He loved trains from the time he was a boy." "And your mother?" "She passed when I was quite young. Influenza." The fictional tragedy rolled off her tongue, but she noticed how Capone's expression softened with sympathy. "I'm sorry. Losing a parent is never easy, especially when you're young." His hand briefly covered hers on the table. "My own father died when I was still establishing myself in business." "Family is precious, Margaret. Never take it for granted." The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard. For a moment, she forgot that she was sitting next to one of America's most wanted criminals, and saw instead a man who understood loss and valued human connection. After dinner, the party moved to the living room where a small band had arrived to provide entertainment. Couples danced to popular tunes of the era, while others gathered around card tables for friendly games of poker. Margaret accepted a glass of genuine French champagne, marveling at the quality of illegal goods that Capone's organization could procure. "Would you care to dance?" Capone appeared beside her, extending his hand with old-fashioned courtesy. "I'd be delighted." On the dance floor, Capone proved to be an excellent dancer, leading her through a foxtrot with smooth confidence. Margaret had learned ballroom dancing as part of her education, but she found herself genuinely enjoying the experience, rather than simply gathering intelligence. "You dance beautifully," Capone said, his breath warm against her ear as he guided her through a turn. "You're an excellent teacher. I imagine you've had plenty of practice." "Some, but I find myself particularly motivated tonight." The implication in his words made Margaret's heart race in ways that had nothing to do with her undercover mission. She was dangerously close to forgetting why she was really here, lost in the music and the warmth of his arms around her. As the evening progressed, Margaret noticed Frank Nitti watching her with continued suspicion. Several times she caught him speaking quietly with other men, their eyes following her movements around the room. The attention made her increasingly nervous, and she began to wonder if her cover had already been compromised. Near midnight, as guests began to take their leave, Capone walked Margaret to the front door where Tommy O'Connor waited with the Cadillac. "I hope you enjoyed yourself tonight," Capone said, helping her with her coat. "It was wonderful. Thank you again for including me." "Margaret," he said quietly, stepping closer so that their conversation couldn't be overheard, "I want you to know that you can trust me. Whatever happens, whatever you might hear about my business, I want you to feel safe in my organization." The words sent a chill through her, suggesting that he might suspect more than he was revealing. "I appreciate that, Al. I do feel safe with you." As the Cadillac pulled away from the house in Cicero, Margaret realized that the evening had accomplished more than she had hoped in terms of gathering intelligence. But it had also complicated her mission in ways she hadn't anticipated. Her feelings toward Al Capone were becoming dangerously personal, and she sensed that his interest in her went far beyond that of an employer toward his secretary. Monday morning following the gathering in Cicero brought an unmistakable shift in the atmosphere at the South Wabash Avenue office. Margaret arrived at her usual time, but she immediately sensed the tension that permeated the building. Conversation stopped when she entered rooms, and several of Capone's associates regarded her with barely concealed suspicion. Frank Nitti stood near her desk when she arrived, his cold eyes examining the contents of her workspace with obvious intent. He looked up as she approached, his expression revealing nothing but barely controlled hostility. "Miss Sullivan, Mr. Capone wants to see you immediately." Margaret's training kicked in, and she maintained her composure despite the alarm bells ringing in her mind. "Of course. Should I bring my stenography materials?" "Just yourself." The walk to Capone's office felt longer than usual, and Margaret was acutely aware of Nitti's presence behind her. She knocked on the door and entered to find Capone seated behind his desk, but his usual warm demeanor had been replaced by an expression of cold calculation that she had never seen before. "Sit down, Margaret." She took her usual seat, noticing that Nitti positioned himself between her and the door. Two other men she didn't recognize stood near the windows, their hands resting casually near their jacket pockets in a way that suggested concealed weapons. "I had a very interesting conversation yesterday with a friend of mine in the police department," Capone began, his voice devoid of the warmth she had grown accustomed to. "It seems there's been some federal interest in our organization lately. Specifically, they've been asking questions about new employees." Margaret's mouth went dry, but she forced herself to maintain eye contact. "I'm not sure I understand what that has to do with me, Al. Don't you?" Capone opened a folder on his desk and withdrew several photographs. "These were taken outside the federal building downtown. That's you, isn't it, Miss Sullivan? Or should I say, Agent Sullivan?" The photographs showed Margaret entering and leaving the federal building on two separate occasions during her training period, before she had infiltrated Capone's organization. Her heart pounded, but she knew that panic would only confirm his suspicions. "I don't understand. Those could be photographs of anyone. Many people have business at federal buildings." Capone's laugh was cold and humorless. "Margaret, please don't insult my intelligence. We both know exactly why you're here and who you really work for." The game was over, and Margaret realized there was no point in maintaining her cover any longer. Agent Mackenzie had prepared her for this possibility, though she had hoped it wouldn't come to this. She straightened in her chair, meeting Capone's gaze with newfound defiance. "Yes, I work for the Bureau of Investigation, but I want you to know that I never intended for things to become personal between us." "Personal?" Capone's voice rose slightly, revealing the first crack in his composed facade. "You think what happened between us was personal? You think I'm some lovesick fool who can't see past a pretty face? I think you're a man who's capable of genuine feeling, despite what you do for a living. And I think Saturday night meant something to both of us, regardless of why I was there originally." Nitti stepped forward menacingly. "Boss, let me handle this. We can't afford to have a federal agent walking around with information about our operations." "Frank's right, you know," Capone said, his voice returning to its cold, businesslike tone. "You've seen too much, learned too much. Standard procedure would be to eliminate the problem permanently." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine, but she refused to show fear. "I understand the position I'm in, but killing a federal agent will bring more heat down on your organization than you can imagine. The Bureau won't stop until they find out what happened to me." "They might not find out what happened," Nitti suggested darkly. "Frank, shut up." Capone's command was sharp and immediate. He stood and walked around his desk, stopping directly in front of Margaret's chair. "Stand up." She rose slowly, unsure of what to expect. Capone reached into his jacket pocket, and for a terrifying moment she thought he was drawing a weapon. Instead, he withdrew a small, leather-bound notebook. "This contains information about shipment schedules, payment records, and territorial agreements. Everything your superiors at the Bureau would need to seriously damage my operations." He held the notebook out to her. "Take it." Margaret stared at the notebook in confusion. "I don't understand." "You're leaving Chicago, Margaret. Tonight. There's a train to New York at 11:15. You'll be on it, and you'll never return to this city. In exchange, I'm giving you enough legitimate evidence to satisfy your superiors without completely destroying my organization." "Why would you do this?" For the first time since she'd entered the office, Capone's expression softened slightly. "Because despite everything, I believe you were telling the truth about Saturday night meaning something to both of us. And because I've never met a woman brave enough to sit in a room full of armed men and refuse to show fear." Nitti protested immediately. "Boss, this is a mistake. She's a federal agent. She can't be trusted." "Frank, my decision is made." Capone's voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to absolute obedience. "Miss Sullivan will be escorted to her apartment to collect her belongings, then to Union Station. If she ever returns to Chicago, or if she shares information beyond what's in that notebook, then we'll revisit this conversation under very different circumstances." Margaret took the notebook with trembling hands, still unable to fully comprehend what was happening. "Al, I want you to know that I never intended to deceive you about my feelings. Whatever else was false, that was real. I know," he said quietly. "That's why you're walking out of here alive." 2 hours later, Margaret sat in a compartment on the New York Central Railroad, watching the Chicago skyline disappear into the distance. The notebook Capone had given her contained enough evidence to satisfy her superiors at the Bureau of Investigation, though not enough to completely dismantle his organization. As the train carried her away from the most dangerous and complicated assignment of her career, Margaret realized that she would spend the rest of her life wondering what might have been if circumstances had been different. She had successfully infiltrated Al Capone's organization and emerged with valuable intelligence, but she had also discovered that the line between duty and personal feeling was far more complicated than her training had prepared her for. The man she was leaving behind was undoubtedly a criminal, but he was also someone who had shown her mercy when he could have chosen violence, and who had recognized something genuine in their connection, despite the deception that had brought them. Together, 5 years had passed since Margaret Sullivan left Chicago on that cold November night in 1925. The Prohibition era was nearing its end in 1930, and the country was grappling with the economic devastation of the stock market crash. Margaret had built a new life for herself in Washington, D.C., working as a senior analyst for the Bureau of Investigation, but the memories of her time with Al Capone had never fully faded. On a rainy Tuesday morning in March, Margaret sat in her office reviewing intelligence reports when her supervisor, Agent William Harrison, knocked on her door. His expression was unusually grave, and he carried a manila envelope marked with the highest classification level. "Margaret, I need to speak with you about a situation in Chicago. It concerns your former assignment." She looked up from her paperwork, immediately alert. "What kind of situation?" "Al Capone has been arrested on federal tax evasion charges. The case is solid, and it looks like he'll finally face serious prison time. But there's been a complication." Harrison sat down across from her desk. "Someone leaked information about your undercover operation to a Chicago newspaper. Your real identity and mission have been compromised." Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. "How is that possible? The operation was classified at the highest level." "We're still investigating, but the damage is done. There are people in Capone's organization who feel he was too lenient with you 5 years ago. With him facing prison time, they may decide to settle old scores." The implications were clear. Margaret's life was in danger, and her location in Washington was no longer secret. She had spent 5 years looking over her shoulder, but the passage of time had gradually eased her vigilance. Now that sense of security was shattered. "What are my options? Officially, we can offer you protection and a new identity. You'd have to disappear completely, start over somewhere far from Chicago." Harrison paused, studying her carefully. "Unofficially, there's another possibility, though it's highly irregular." "What do you mean?" Harrison slid the manila envelope across her desk. "Capone sent this through his attorney. He wants to see you before his sentencing. He claims to have information about the leak that could help us identify who's targeting you." Margaret stared at the envelope, her heart racing. The idea of seeing Al Capone again after 5 years filled her with a mixture of anticipation and dread. "You want me to meet with him?" "I want you to consider it. The information he's offering could be valuable, and frankly, he may be your best chance of identifying the threat against you." Harrison leaned forward. "But I won't order you to do this, Margaret. It's entirely your decision." That evening, Margaret sat in her small apartment overlooking the Potomac River, holding the letter that Harrison had given her. Capone's handwriting was elegant and precise, the product of a man who took pride in personal presentation despite his criminal activities. The letter was brief but carried an emotional weight that surprised her. He acknowledged that seeing her would be difficult for both of them, but he insisted that he had information crucial to her safety. More importantly, he wrote that he had spent 5 years wondering if she ever thought about their time together, and he wanted the chance to speak with her honestly, without the pretense and deception that had defined their previous relationship. 3 days later, Margaret found herself on a train bound for Chicago, dressed in a simple grey suit and carrying identification that listed her as a federal attorney. The Cook County Jail was a forbidding brick building that housed some of the most dangerous criminals in the country, and Margaret felt a familiar tension as she was escorted through multiple security checkpoints. The meeting room was small and sterile, with a single table and 2 chairs separated by a thick glass partition. When the guards brought Capone in, Margaret was shocked by the change in his appearance. Prison had aged him considerably, and the confident, charismatic man she remembered had been replaced by someone who looked tired and worn down by circumstance. "Hello, Margaret." His voice was softer than she remembered, carrying none of the authority that had once commanded absolute loyalty from his organization. "Hello, Al. You wanted to see me?" "I did. First, I want you to know that I kept my word about Chicago. I never revealed your real identity or your mission to anyone in my organization, but someone else did, and I know who." For the next hour, Capone provided Margaret with detailed information about Frank Nitti's rise to power within the organization and his growing resentment over Capone's decision to spare her life 5 years earlier. Nitti had discovered her true identity through contacts in the Chicago Police Department and had been planning his revenge ever since. "Frank never understood why I let you go," Capone explained. "He saw it as weakness, and he's been using it to undermine my authority. With me facing prison time, he figures he can eliminate you without consequences." "Why are you telling me this? Why help me now?" Capone was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes studying her face through the glass partition. "Because I meant what I said 5 years ago. What we had was real, despite the circumstances that brought us together. And because I've spent every day since then wondering what might have happened if things had been different." Margaret felt tears threatening, emotions she had buried for 5 years suddenly surfacing. "Al, I need you to know that I never forgot about you either, but we both know there was no future for us, given who we are and what we represent." "I know, but I also know that I love you, Margaret Sullivan. I've loved you since that first day in my office, and I'll love you until the day I die. That's not going to change, whether I'm in prison or free." The confession hung in the air between them, separated by glass and steel, but carrying the weight of 5 years of unspoken feelings. Margaret placed her hand against the glass, and Capone mirrored the gesture from his side. "I love you too, Al. God help me, but I do." "Then promise me something," Capone said urgently. "Promise me you'll be careful. Use the information I've given you to protect yourself, and don't trust anyone in the Chicago organization. They're not all loyal to me anymore." 2 weeks later, Margaret watched from the gallery of a federal courthouse as Al Capone was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison for tax evasion. It was a victory for law enforcement and the end of an era in Chicago's criminal history. But for Margaret, it felt like the closing of a chapter in her own life that had never been properly resolved. Using the intelligence Capone had provided, the Bureau of Investigation was able to neutralize the threat against Margaret's life and arrest several members of Nitti's faction on various federal charges. She remained in Washington, continuing her career in federal law enforcement, but she never forgot the man who had chosen love over revenge and had risked everything to protect her one final time. In quiet moments, she would remember the way he had looked at her through that prison glass, and she would wonder about the different life they might have shared in a world where duty and love didn't have to stand in opposition to each other. Al Capone, the notorious gangster of Prohibition-era Chicago, had discovered that his secretary was a federal spy, but instead of choosing violence, he had chosen love. It was a decision that defined both of their lives long after their paths had diverged forever.